Let's do some stuff.
Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Alright, before we start, I'd like to congratulate both teams for making it to quarterfinals at the GW2. Congrats to all. That being said, call upon Prime Minister to open up this round. You're here.
So Matt and I wanted to pick a case that's going to be fun and interesting and that most of these judges haven't seen yet. So we tell you it's the year 1962. You are an anti-colonial revolutionary movement in Africa. Should you be a Marxist or a nationalist movement? Any questions?
Any particular country?
Nope, so we don't want to bind you to like, any particular historical subset. We're going to say like what your country roughly looks like. It's colonized by someone in Europe. It's basically like a resource factory, we're going to say, as most of these colonies were, like loose infrastructure that's just enough to govern like the extraction of said resources.
Like not South Africa.
No, we're not going to say like...
You're not a settler colony.
No.
Okay.
You're like an average run-of-the-mill colony
Yeah, like,
somewhere.
Okay. And we're in power now?
No, so you're starting your revolutionary
Okay,
movement.
we're starting a religion.
Yep.
So how much popular support does this potential revolution have?
So we think this is going to be up for debate, like which format you choose, like with which format you choose, like whether you're going to get support or not. We're going to say on the whole, people like don't like being a colony. Like that's a pretty like universally shared feeling, like it's shitty to be a colony. But we don't think you have like necessarily a critical mass or just like a group of people. Otherwise, you don't think it'd be realistic to have one. If this is like inherently like a nebulous case that's meant to be like ideally, what would you pick?
And so the two things again, Marxism and nationalism.
Yep.
And revolting against the colonial power, I presume military revolt.
Probably.
If you want to try a peaceful revolt, you can go ahead.
You're welcome.
Okay, yeah, or it could be both.
Do you
Absolutely.
have any information on, whether the people prefer a Marxist or a nationalist revolution?
I think this is a lot of like what the debate
Yeah, a
is
lot
about.
of
What
debate is
typically
going to be what do
people
people
prefer.
Okay, I
prefer.
understand.
And we don't know which European country.
Probably England or
France.
France.
Yeah, but that's
Alright.
Just because like
or like the one Belgian.
yeah, there's one with Belgium and two with Portugal, so odds are.
Okay, Sub-Saharan?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
It's my favorite section of
Okay.
it.
I think we're going to go Marxist, and John will help.
Cool. Alright. So, guys, we're really excited to be defending nationalism. I'm also really excited to have a team that didn't ask us to define nationalism, which means I think we're going to have a really engaging round. So the first thing we want to tell you, we have 4 points as to why you must be a nationalist revolution. The first, to get a broader base of support internally. The first and foremost thing for you in this revolution is to unite your nation. This is so, so important. But we tell you that Marxism is inherently ideologically exclusionary and alienating. Your goal is independence and self-governance, and staking out hard-line policy positions will let opposition know or oppose how you will be independent, in addition to the fact that you will be independent. So when you say, we just want to be an independent country, that's one thing. You want to say, I want to be a communist independent country, that is another level for them to say, it is absolutely unacceptable for you to become independent. We tell you, though, more so than this, the other fact you're giving them another way, another level in which to oppose you, that in order to have this revolution successfully, you need influential groups like the bourgeoisie in order to effectively negotiate with Europe and tell you how to start a new economy. I think when you're this kind of country, because basically your only infrastructure is like resource extraction, so you need the people with the money and with the connections to actually help you negotiate deals. We don't think this is going to be successful when you either kick out or kill all these people that are really essential to like the Europe, to Europe, and they're a pretty tenuous alliance with you as a new potential nation. But our second independent point is that because this is 1962, we don't want Cold War backlash from the United States and Europe. So the first thing is obviously Marxism is the USSR, right? Pretty strongly linked, we're going to say there. And the US has a broad history of intervening to change ideologically different regimes. And this is now fully in the swing of the Cold War. So in the past, if they're going to intervene pretty much anywhere, they always try to intervene when this new regime becomes Marxist. But we tell you that this Marxist path also encourages US backing of your opponents and probably the colonizers. So once again, you're not only having the people that are colonizing you trying to say, no, you can't be free, you have the US backing them. Now, if you want to buy that on their side of the house, they even succeed at all, which we don't think is going to happen, we see that then the Western-backed coup is like not even likely, it's pretty much imminently going to happen, which you don't see any of the impacts of the revolution. We're going to look at things like South America. When you have revolutions that the U.S. fundamentally disagrees with, they then go in and deal with them. We take a look at Guatemala, look at Honduras, look at all these different countries. The U.S. has said, you know what, I don't think so, gone in and dealt with it. But beyond that, we say, you starting this revolution, why are you uniquely going to be harmed by this? That when you start off as a on-face Marxist revolutionary, when your country is pretty inevitably overthrown, you personally, or you as the first couple people starting this movement, are likely to be persecuted, jailed, or even killed by the U.S. as a symbol to say, no, communism is unacceptable, we're not going to allow this to take hold and become this revolutionary aspect throughout Africa as well. Because we tell you, this is where the Cold War is primarily being fought at this point. We don't think it's in areas, obviously, we're going to say Churchill, not going to be a big communist factor. Any U.S. president, not going to be a communist factor. It's going to be fought in these third world countries, and the U.S. is going to take a hard-line position here. But our third independent point is why you cannot embrace another oppressive European system. That Marxism was created by Germans and then institutionalized by Russians, both of which are imperialist nations. So it's completely ideologically fascist to say, we don't like your imperialism, but yours is okay. We think you've been a colony, this is absolutely what you want to overthrow. The other problem is, though, this system was created based on very, very different social conditions from those which exist in your nation, and embraces many similar normative and macro-organizational concepts to the one which you then overthrew. We don't think it's okay to say that you're the same kind of country that Russia was, or the USSR had, the Germans were basing this theory on. However, nationalism on our side of the house lets you embrace and utilize what is specific to your nation and likely to be the most effective based on your social context. I want to talk about nationalism as a whole here because normally we explain it in POCs. Let's talk about why it's so important. Is that nationalism is literally saying what is best for our country, let's do that. Not taking this blanket Marxist policy that they have to follow, which we don't think works well in pretty much the situation it's already been utilized in, but is especially not going to do well in your country where you don't have the infrastructure to support the basic tenets of a Marxist movement. When you say nationalism, whatever your country's ideological basis is, whatever your religious basis is, whatever your people actually value, this is when you get support to say what is actually going to work for this revolution and then what is going to work after. So we don't think having a revolution that then immediately crumbles after, there's no point to wasting the human capital or the political capital this is going to take. So finally to this though, we tell you why you ought not embrace this oppressive system is because a major problem of the imperialist colonialism is that it disregards your people's culture and way of life. Marxism does the exact same thing to the nth degree. It also imposes an even stricter economic system. When it says you're not able to have your sort of culture, you must exist in this dichotomy that exists within Marxism rather than be your own people, and we think that since you haven't been able to embrace your own identity in so long, you ought to fully embrace it now and use that as your new impetus for freedom. So our fourth and final point is the idea of ideological freedom. The first thing we tell you is that nationalism places the goal solely on independence and gives you the ideological freedom as to what kind of system is implemented once it is successful. So this is not the idea, because if you become a Marxist and a Marxist revolution, you then have to have a Marxist government. This is not like Marxist revolution, now let's be capitalist. That's not how that's going to work, right? So what we tell you is if you want to place the goal solely on independence, galvanize the most people to your movement, because we are think they're going to bring up the idea of maybe not everyone agrees on all the same principles. We do think everyone agrees that we don't want to be a colony anymore. So when you say, this is our shared identity, let's figure out what system economically works best for us, this is absolutely the thing to do. We also tell you, though, this is particularly important in such a volatile geopolitical environment. You'll need to be able to adapt to changing scenarios, allies, and surrounding revolutions. Being that at this point in time, most of Africa and a lot of the other colonies that are still being held are trending anti-colonial. So if you were to place yourself as solely the only Marxist nation in this area, because the rest of them are going to be smart and have the nationalist movement like we say you should, then you're going to be alone. You're not going to have allies in this region. You're not going to be able to adapt to the changing geopolitical environment, and eventually the U.S. is just going to come in like shit all over your regime. So why is this additionally a problem? We do tell you though. So again, this is something I already said, but for Marxists, changing from the initial ideas and policies that are part of your revolution is betrayal of Marxism's principles at heart, because the revolution is policy-oriented rather than independence-oriented. And this is incredibly important because we also don't think that the people that are living in this colony are fully educated on who Marx was, why Marx wrote what he wrote, and not being able to identify on this sort of level with Karl Marx. What they can identify with is someone saying, I have lived your experiences, let's talk about this, let's become free, and after freedom, work on how we want to polish out this government. And really, for all these reasons, we're proud to propose.
Then speaking for that speech, we now call upon the leader of the opposition. Here, here.
All set? Now, we broadly agree on side opposition that our main goal should be to achieve independence, but we've actually had a wrinkle to this. We want to ensure that our country will be a good place to live in the years after this revolution succeeds. And so we're going to try to, that'll work its way, especially when we get to the off case. So let's start right on. First of all, we think that Marxism is a more viable unifying principle for our movement than nationalism could ever be. So let's talk about what's going on in Africa right now. The way the borders of these African countries are drawn is rather arbitrary. It depends more on geographic distinctions that don't correspond to actual ethnic groups or actual nations, as you may call them, in Africa. They're mostly drawn by European powers who simply don't understand what's going on. And so a nationalist movement is going to have the inherent problem of, first of all, any given group of people with the same kind of language, ethnicity, religion that might be able to coalesce into a nation are not only going to struggle to be a majority in any given country, but these nations are going to be split across the borders of these states. And so nationalism is going to be an inherently difficult way to bind enough people in one political state together in order to achieve solvency for side government. And they need to address this. On the other hand, Marxism is a relatively universalist ideology, right? Everybody, if they buy into Marxism, can agree with it. Every single person in our nation state can get together and oppose colonialism as one body. And as a result of this, we're going to have a much better chance of getting the sort of popular support, getting the sort of ideological support from all sectors of our geographic region that are necessary to achieve political success. Furthermore, regarding the issue of nationalism, is that if, say, our nation, our people rise in a nationalist way in, say, Botswana, and in a neighboring country, our compatriots, people who speak the same language as the same ethnicity, also rise as part of that movement, we risk the potential to draw in additional European countries. Because now this has become a multinational problem that not only the Belgians, but also the French and the British are concerned with. This is actually a much greater threat in terms of this multinational clampdown that side government worries about when they talk about the U.S., because the main countries we need to be worried about are the countries with vested interest in keeping these colonies: England, France, and Belgium. And so if we create a coalition among these three countries against just us, then we're much more likely to win down. We stand a better chance if we focus on isolating politically the specific nation we're trying to deal with, and that's going to depend on focusing on a geographic region rather than a sort of nation and ethnic situation. Second of all, we think that Marxism presents a more cogent response to colonialism. And what does this mean? So Marxism fundamentally opposes colonialism. It's all about the idea that people should not be oppressed for class reasons. And why is this more useful to combat colonialism? It gives us ideological firepower to say colonialism is inherently wrong. Nationalism doesn't achieve this. Why? Because the whole idea of an empire is a grouping of many nations into one body politic. And so if we have many nations that can be grouped together imperially, then England's going to say, oh, yes, you people have your nation. It just happens to be integrated into a larger British empire. Maybe we'll give you some autonomy or something. And then they can win the war of hearts and minds necessary to defuse our revolutionary movement. Marxism, on the other hand, is fundamentally incompatible with colonialism. And so we're not going to have the risk of this loss of momentum. If we can convince enough people to go Marxist, then we're necessarily going to have political willpower to become fully independent. Yeah.
How can you say that's true when every major communist country at this time has colonies?
That's not true. China doesn't have colonies. Colonialism just isn't an inherent part of Marxism. I think that's clear. So finally, we get to the moral advantages of Marxism. Because again, we want to make sure that our country is as good a place to live in the future. And so one major issue we see as these African post-colonial states become independent is that they devolve into kleptocratic rentier states, right? So the government extracts natural resources, sells them to Western countries, everybody in the government keeps the money for themselves and lives in mansions. And we think this is a serious threat. Why is Marxism an antidote to this sort of problem, this sort of economic stagnation, gross inequality, poverty, all the things that result from becoming a rentier state and never being able to progress? First of all, Marxism, again, prides itself on equality. We think it's actually a good thing when the government says that we won't be able to waffle on our economic positions in the future, because we're going to have to be committed, and all of our compatriots are going to have to be committed to the goal of economic progress, of industrialization, of throwing off the old economic ties that make colonialism such an issue for these countries. And as a result, we're going to actually have a chance of becoming a more equal, socially responsible state in the future. We think Marxism is a more realistic way of doing this than nationalism, which again, not only is going to not have the ideological combat necessary to combat the idea of a rentier state, but also is going to inherently lead to ethnic conflict. There's going to be some level of revanchism when our particular group takes over the country. We're not going to respect other groups. Marxism is the solution to this particular thing. So let's get to the on case. The first thing they say is that we're going to have a broader support base as a result of nationalism. And this clashes obviously directly with our problem of the fact that African nations don't correspond to the geographic borders of these countries. So first of all, they think, well, we won't have to take ideological stances so we can build a wider support base. We actually disagree. We think an ideological stance is the best way to build a broad support base because ideology can spread among all economic strata, can spread among all languages, all religions, and all peoples. We think we actually have a much better chance of accomplishing this. The idea that we should rely on the bourgeoisie is absurd. The bourgeoisie are the people who have the most incentive to cling to the old colonial order. They benefit the most from the status quo, and so relying on them in the first place is unrealistic. But furthermore, we think that actually taking them down is a useful way to kind of unify support, because if we have this group of elite like people within our society who happen to be loyal to the Europeans, then the Europeans can now say, oh, these people actually want to be part of empire, and they will like put these people on TV, and then the guy will say, yes, I love living in this country, it's great, I love being part of the British Empire. We don't want that to happen. We want the broad political message to be that not only do we disagree with the colonialism in general, but we disagree with the inequality imposed by colonialism. We disagree with the idea that these people are going to support this territory for the sake of promoting their own personal prestige. Second of all, we have the idea of Cold War backlash. And sure, the United States is a superpower. There also exists a communist superpower in 1962. It's known as the USSR. We think it's very possible to gain some sort of international support for communism. We think it's actually more likely because, unlike the United States, which is mostly focused on safeguarding its economic interests, containment is an issue, but they haven't managed to get all the way into Vietnam yet. We think the USSR has a much stronger ideological basis for supporting newly communist countries, because one of the notions of the Russian Revolution, of the sort of national myth of the Soviet Union, is that they want to support communism across the world. And so we think we'll actually have a much easier time getting some kind of international aid if we go with the communist, like the Comintern, instead of some capitalist country that's not going to necessarily help us. And furthermore, there's no reason for the U.S. to come to our aid. So we have no superpower backing on the government side of the case, but we have the real chance of getting a huge boon of the USSR support on our side. Second of all, the idea that we will be held responsible personally, this is non-unique. So if we're a military dictator who happens to be nationalist, we're going to be put in jail after we're deposed. If we're a Marxist dictator, we're going to be put in jail after we're deposed. Assuming we get deposed at some point, that's going to be an issue for both sides of the case. We're not too worried about this for the sake of this debate. Finally, that we can't use a European ideology. Marxism wasn't designed for this. It worked fine for Mao Zedong. He managed to, in a non-European country, he did have to rebrand it a little. He did change it over to Maoism, but it's actually very easy. Marxism is a malleable, it's a rather plastic ideology as long as you focus on the core idea of class conflict, as long as you focus on the ideas that communicate so well to individual people, we can tailor it to our own particular country. I think this is actually why it's so ideologically powerful for attaining independence. Nationalism works, they say. We don't think it's going to work in Africa. We think nationalism is actually going to run counter to the idea of having unified, stable states. Even if we achieve independence on a nationalist basis, we're going to have a fundamentally unstable state on side government. And as a result of this, insofar as we want our country to be a good one, not only an independent one, we think this is an issue. Second of all, imperialism disregards our culture and our way of life. This is another issue with nationalism, because if we are a nationalist state, then there are necessarily going to be marginalized ethnic groups within our country. We want to have a universalist approach. Finally, the idea of ideological freedom. Again, Marxism is malleable. Our policy is independent, we agree. Marxism is the only policy in this round that is fundamentally incompatible with colonialism. Nationalism runs the risk of falling back into an unequal rentier state. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. And now I'll call upon the member of the government. Here.
Alright, thanks everyone. I'm going to do my best to stay audible, but I can't promise. So, the first argument that we get from sign off in this round is that Marxism is just more universal, more easy to justify. He says there are these arbitrary borders drawn all throughout Africa, which means that you have religious and ethnic groups who often disagree with each other, who often hate each other within the same borders. That's a big fucking problem for their side of the house, where Marxism says that culture doesn't matter because history is materially determined. This means that there's no reason to disregard those borders because different cultures don't matter. So on our side of the house, when we say that culture is important, we can say the Hutus are one nation, the Tutsis are another, and we don't end up with a Rwandan genocide. Whereas on their side of the house, they have to believe that all of these people are drawn together by a common class interest, and they has literally no solution when the machetes come out. The next thing they say under this is like everyone that buys into Marxism is able to support it. So this is true, but then they have to give you warrants why people in this area of the world are going to buy into Marxism. So firstly, it's critically important that these people are in countries where all media access is controlled by Western European countries which are allied with the United States. This means that the only things that these people will be allowed to hear about Marxism through the mass media, which is like almost a monopoly on media in these areas, is the gulags and the killing fields, is everything that is the worst about the Soviet Union, about the PRC, about Castro's Cuba, which means they only ever hear the nightmare stories. They never actually hear anything about like why it might be good. This is why like if you're like England or France trying to continue to get aid from the United States, I'll take one on the on case. You are never going to like allow like Castro or Che into your colonies to talk to your people about the wonders of a Marxist revolution. Furthermore, because a lot of these areas which are desperately poor in the world tend to be the most strongly religious, this is an important propaganda tool that the colonial powers and just the Western elite generally use. That when like church officials are routinely murdered throughout the Soviet Union and through the PRC, this is an incredibly powerful tool in propagandizing to the people about why they shouldn't believe in Marxism, because it means that they will lose the faith that they consider often to be the most important part of their lives. Next thing he says, like, you don't want to like unite European countries in a multinational coalition against you. Yeah, that's true. So don't take the Soviet Union side in the Cold War. All of these European countries are against it. That's what's definitely going to unite. Second thing he tells you about is like it's a more cogent response to colonialism. He says, communist countries can't have empires, it's ideologically incoherent. So even if it's ideologically incoherent, it still happens. The Soviet Union took over all of Eastern Europe. China took Manchuria. I'm not sure if they've taken Tibet yet, but it's something they're planning on. They effectively have North Korea as a colony, and it's not something that this government is in any way opposed to, as you see through their proxy wars in Southeast Asia, where they're effectively taking over their governments. Next thing this says, this is all just like Marxism can't have colonies, and like you can have multiple nations within an empire. So yes, you theoretically can have multiple nations within an empire, but theoretically if you're having an anti-colonial nationalist revolution, it is a brand of nationalism which says that all nations deserve equal political say. So within the British Empire, this might not be something which is inherently bad if all of the colonies have equal representation within it as an equal country. But the reason why nationalism matters in this case is because it is the English nation which is making the decisions through the empire for all of your other nations. This fundamental inequality between nations is what our revolution is then based on. Third argument he gives you is why this could become a kleptocracy. He says there are all sorts of reasons why government officials will try to just use resource extraction in a sort of mercantilist way, just steal everything for themselves. So on their side of the house, they're going to put all of this resource extraction in charge of the state, in charge of the exact officials that they say are going to steal everything. If they want to actually look to historical examples, just look directly to the Soviet Union, where literally the thing that they're most worried about actually happened, because they put this government in charge of these resources, people who are generally poor, people who still believe in ethnic and religious divides that Marxism refused to acknowledge and had no way of actually fixing. Where on our side of the house, we can construct a nationalism which is more broad, which is more unifying, which heals the wounds of the past, and actually brings our nation together. On our side of the house, when we have these resources far more decentralized between a large number of corporations, a large number of firms, it's much less likely that corrupt state officials, like whoever it is that is in charge of like any communist country around the world, which are why like the people in the inner party always live significantly better with their like Rolls Royces and their fur coats than the like starving people in bread lines in St. Petersburg. Another thing he says is ethnic conflict. Ethnic conflict still exists on their side of the house. These divisions still exist. Marxism pretends to ignore them, but the people won't. The people will still act on them. On our side of the house, we create a more unifying nationalism that actually deals with them. Now to go on case. First thing we talked about is why this gets to a broader base of support. Now what they say is like a good ideological stance is able to draw everyone in. And you're like, you shouldn't rely on the bourgeoisie. So a good ideological stance that all of these people agree with would be able to draw them in. But what nationalism definitionally is like the aggregate of what all of the people in the nation believe. This means that ours is an ideology which is going to be most broad and appealing to everyone. So yes, even if you don't buy any of our warrants about religion, about propaganda, about like anti-capitalism, about everything else, why these people wouldn't believe in Marxism, there are just some people throughout the world who happen not to be Marxists because not the whole world is the like more leftist section of ACTA. This means that all of these people are never going to be able to buy into their revolution, whereas Marxists still may be able to buy into ours, because we are still working for a goal which is not incompatible with Marxism in the future. And this is critically important, where they don't respond to Emily's argumentation about why Marxism is based on different macro-organizational structures, but also...
Why would a Hutu side with Tutsi nationalists?
So we think this is very simple, that you wouldn't have Tutsi nationalists in Rwanda as if you're going to form a broad revolution. That's a dumb way to do nationalism. You wouldn't, like, you shouldn't do that in much the same way that we could all, like, equally pose why would Tutsis, like, ally with Tutsi Marxists, because if they still view them as nothing more than the aggregation of their ethnic and clan identity, then that problem still applies on their side of the house. But on our side of the house, when we don't say that you are Hutu or you are Tutsi, but that you are Rwanda, we are able to begin to bring the people together. But the critical problem when they don't respond to Emily's points about macro-organizational structures is that Marxism is based on the idea that places have a certain kind of class system in order to actually develop to Marxism. You can't just take any country and then make a Marxist utopia out of it. This is why, like Lenin and Marx and everyone agree, you need an industrial state. Marxism is based on the proletariat rising up, but on their side of the house, when the majority of your country are destitutely poor factory farmers or people who are just working in the mines, when you don't have almost any urban industrial base that is the bread and butter of any Marxist revolution, they don't actually get there. They do need a self-sufficient stage of capitalism and development to start with in order to be to have enough resources to sustain and distribute to the rest of their population. And then he says, oh yeah, fuck the bourgeoisie. This is really problematic because these are the people who are literally the most influential people in Europe. We also tell you that there are non-European bourgeoisie. There are middle-class business people who are indigenous within your own country. Just because your country gets really upset when they can't run any businesses, so colonial entities make concessions. Just like our India round GW final last time, if you want to see examples of this. But the critical problem here is that when they alienate the bourgeoisie, they alienate the only people that Europe will ever listen to as middlemen, which means their only solution for a revolution is fighting a bloody civil war that will take years, that will kill hundreds of thousands of other people, and which most likely they will lose because they are fighting the most powerful countries in the world, backed by the United States, when you have effectively allied with who is their most sworn enemy. Second argument we give you is Cold War backlash. This is critical. There has never been a successful Marxist anti-colonial revolution which the United States did not quickly sweep in and oust, kill the leaders, and install a puppet regime which was just as bad. Say, they haven't gotten to Vietnam yet. Yes, they have. The paratroopers are down. The Kennedy administration just assassinated the royal family so that they were better able to take control of South Vietnam and push their forces forward. Yes, the war hasn't been won in the last week, but we think that it's going to be exactly like Korea or anywhere else. But the point where this is written really important is when they say we're going to ally with the Soviet Union and we're going to model our form of, well, firstly, the Soviet Union really doesn't have the resources to bleed out to this. They've already bankrupted the Comintern by spending all of their money on the Cuban and the Vietnamese revolution. But furthermore, that they only get Soviet support if they are Stalinists. So the Soviet Union will not support any brand of Marxism at all. This is why the Sino-Soviet split happened, because Mao's China, in the way that they say they want to model it, was not respecting what they believed was true ideological Marxism, so support was cut off. They say Mao just had to model it a little bit. Yeah, Mao had to model it a little bit in a way that killed 100 million of his people. We don't think that this is anything which you should ever justify. This is also why you need the basic class structure to start with. Last thing he says is no, nationalism also disregards your culture. So nationalism may prioritize part of your culture, but Marxism says nothing but class matters. Your culture is shit. It doesn't matter at all, and we're so proud to propose.
Here.
Thank you for that speech. Now call upon the member of the opposition. Here.
Okay, is everyone ready? Alright, so let's begin with op case. Well, first, we talked about the whole unifying principle that Marxism upholds. Now, what we see in these African countries, again, we stress, is that it is not actually borders drawn along real ethnic lines. It is not reality based on culture, based on religion. So it is impossible to have a nationalist revolution because even if you have a common goal of overthrowing a colonial power, afterwards, once you got rid of this common enemy, this is when the sectionalism begins to show. This is when you begin to have civil war, instability that is ultimately going to screw you over. Marxism, on the other hand, is a long-term ideological goal. Not where it is just simply predicated on the fact that you have a common enemy, and because you guys, have to live in the same geographic area controlled by the same power, that you are, somehow the same part of the same nation. It's not going to hold up in the future. That's not how it's going to work. Now, what the Gov has said is that Marxism, the point that that Marxism is a bad thing, because what we need to do is that we need to use nationalism as a way to unite people. Again, we say it's arbitrary. It does not hold as much clout as Marxism. Marxism, on the other hand, is a clear contrast to what the colonial powers have been advocating as a system, where there's a two-tiered system of this colonial master and their bourgeoisie proxies, and you have the inhabitants, the mass majority of the inhabitants of these colonized powers, who are being forced to work in plantations, forced to work on all these rubber industries with minimum pay. We believe that this is something they can relate to. This is an ideology that they can hold in clear contrast to what they have been, the horrors they have been going through in the past few years. They talk about Rwanda, being a result of unsuccessful nationalization. That's the point. People simply cannot relate to nationalism when for thousands of years they have had a different culture, a different religion. The point of Marxism is to transcend these national boundaries, unite them by ideology, so all these sectional divides are no longer in the mindset of people because they're united by coherent ideology they can all relate to. Furthermore, we have said that there's a risk of spillover into other colonies precisely because of these tribal boundaries not being conducive to what the actual country's boundaries are. What they say is that the Cold War is going to override this anyway. So we're going to piss off powers regardless. But the thing is, the Cold War is a matter of proxy bipolar warfare. You as America, you want a government conducive to your policy views in this specific country. Sure, that might be some incentive for them to intervene. But the problem is what happens on their side of the house is that it's not just a proxy war. This is a direct spillover. This is a direct conflict between these tribal rebels and a foreign colonial power. That's far more incentive for a country to intervene against you. Then they get up here and say, people aren't going to like Marxism, even if it's a broad-ranging thing they can relate to because of Western propaganda, because of nightmare media that the Westerners have been propagating. The point is, it's not just about the fact that they are listening to the media, it's the fact that they've actually lived through the horrors of colonial capitalism, where they have to live as second-class citizens. They can relate to Marxism in that way. Anyway, they're not going to buy into this propaganda. The whole point, they said in their case contract, the majority of people do not like the Western powers. If they do not like the Western powers and are considering revolting against them, do you think they're going to buy into the propaganda? Obviously not. Okay, so the second thing we have said is that Marxism is a more potent response because there's a contrast to colonialism, and we have ideological firepower to back it up because it shows a clear contrast and it divides us. It puts us on one corner and them on the other corner. You have a clear divide. You are either with them or you are against them. Now, what they have said is they didn't really have much of a response to this. Other than saying that Marxism isn't broad. Same thing that they said to our first point. They kind of dropped this. Finally, we talked about kleptocracy, about how under a nationalist government, you're going to have a lot of these corrupt officials, a lot of these bourgeoisie elites, embezzling all this money that they gain from oil revenue. They're going to be involved in graft. They say that's not unique because it's going to happen under a communist regime. But the point is, even if we attempt it, it has a better chance of succeeding or eliminating all this corruption under a communist regime because under a communist regime, our ideology is predicated off the masses of the people benefiting. If our root is based off a coherent ideology that is against corruption, against graft, there's a strong chance that officials are going to uphold this. Now let's go on. Yes.
When your country's economy is 90% diamonds and capitalist countries cut you off for being a communist, how do your people not starve?
Again, what we say is that this whole idea of other countries getting involved, it's going to happen either way. It's just going to be more severe if you have a nationalist revolution because, again, unlike when we have a Marxist revolution, you are going in direct conflict with other countries because of Civil War spillover, which I will get to on our case. Now, first the GW stood up here, and they said that nationalism has a broader base of support because it is based off the common people, and Marxism is not relatable. We already rebutted this pretty sufficiently, we think. Nationalism is not based on reality. It's completely arbitrary, based on a common enemy. It is not good for the long term. Once you get rid of this common enemy, what's the justification for nationalism when you have all these cultural and religious divides? Nothing. Marxism, on the other hand, provides a long-term, sustainable way of governing a country. You know how to deal with econ. You know how to deal with how to deal with how to deal with the inner workings of societal infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. It is a long-term solution. Nationalism is not. Furthermore, they say that we have to have an industrial base in order to sustain a Marxist revolution because that's what happened in Russia. I mean, they failed to acknowledge the fact that Marxism is, unlike nationalism, is quite adaptable. We saw in China. China did not have an industrial base where they had their communist revolution. It was completely based on peasant revolution. As long as you have a bipolar system where there's one class of people being ostracized, one class of people being abused by an upper class, in this case the colonial power and their bourgeoisie proxies, you are going to have resentment and you are going to have a revolution among the lower class who are pissed off the way they're being treated. You saw it happen in China with the peasants. No industrialization is needed for a Marxist revolution to occur. Then they said we're going to alienate the middlemen. because and these middlemen are vital for the process. The thing is, ladies and gentlemen, we should be focusing on uniting broad sectors of the masses of the population. Marxism appeals to the vast majority of people because, again, they have lived under a colonial system. Marxism provides an antidote to this colonial system in the long term. These people in the bourgeoisie, maybe they might be maybe some of them might be inclined to go to your side if you're less extreme on these economic issues. But the fact is, they're in the bag for the colonialists. They like the status quo because they're benefiting most from it. The colonialists need them as middlemen, again, as the LO said, to demonstrate native support for them. As a result, they're going to give all these chits and benefits. Bourgeoisie likes colonialists. No point trying to appease them. Then they say no Cold War. Then they said that there's going to be no Cold War backlash. Again, the Soviet Union it's a bipolar world in the Cold War. The Soviet Union is going to come to our side. They say that there hasn't been a successful instance where there's a Marxist revolution and that has been overthrown by the Americans. They're kind of cherry picking on this. I mean, you look at Cuba. Cuba is a very famous instance of a successful communist revolution. Cuba is still, as of 1962, a communist country. We saw the Bay of Pigs invasion. That didn't go very well, did it? America's not all powerful. Soviet Union is equal in terms of strength. We can rely on the Soviet Union back, as furthermore, we're not going to have spillover that result in international intervention. And for all these reasons, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Please speak about speech. Now call upon the leader of the opposition to close out his side. The speech not to exceed 4 minutes and 30 seconds. To extend to welcome. New arguments will have to be called out by the government side, and at that point, each judge and panel will take it under consideration.
So I've got 2 broad themes for this rebuttal. First, I want to ask the questions: what is a nation, and what are we? Now, on side opposition, we present you a relatively coherent idea of what a nation is. It is a people unified by language, religion, ethnicity. These are the things that have always corresponded to nations. And what are we? We are an arbitrarily defined, box-shaped state sitting in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa for purely political reasons. Not just political reasons, but the politics of a continent that is not our own. So why is there a fundamental incongruity here? The issue is that there does not exist a single country in sub-Saharan Africa whose borders correspond to anything like a nation. This is why, fundamentally, government has the problem. They need to show why nationalism is feasible, why it even exists in sub-Saharan Africa. There is no such thing as Rwandan nationalism. We have Hutu nationalism. And when you form a country based on nationalist pressures, not only do you have the problem of trying to convince people why that even makes sense in the first place, but you inevitably get to bloodshed. We have examples from previous countries that became independent on other continents. China, as we keep talking about, went Marxist, went with her broad ideological power, and despite interference from Western powers, managed to become independent, managed to remain contiguous. India went with nationalism. India has been ripped apart by internal tensions into India and Pakistan and Bangladesh as a direct result of the fact that they focus on nationalist ties which do not correspond to their own borders. We want to remain contiguous because stability is essential to success as a nation afterwards, because it's essential to having any sort of recognition on the international stage. And as a result of this, we just think that nationalism does not compute with the fact that we are an arbitrary geographic distinction. My second theme is about having a realistic path to independence. We think we need to do 2 main things to become independent. First, we need to convince the people within our state to become independent, and second of all, we need to compel the imperial power to release us. So what do we get from side government about convincing the people of our state to become independent? We have nationalism. Now, their nationalism isn't based on anything. It's based only on national borders. It doesn't make any sense. Rwanda, as a concept, isn't relevant at all to just an average farmer living in Rwanda. They identify with their tribe, with their religion, with their language, rather than with this arbitrary nation state that they've never heard of and don't care about. As a result of this, side government has failed to warrant at all why nationalism is going to be a compelling reason to leave. There's an additional problem with nationalism regarding colonialism, and that is that colonialism is compatible with nationalism. The definition of an empire is a collection of nation states under one central power. And as a result, European powers are going to have the outlet to nationalist tensions of saying, oh, we'll give you more autonomy, or we'll give special privileges to Hutus, as the Belgians did in Rwanda. As a result of this, we're not going to be actually able to build any broad consensus either in our country or in the world at large that we need to become independent as a result of nationalism. We can become extremely nationalist and remain a colony. Second of all, we need to, on side opposition, however, Marxism prevents a fundamentally incompatible ideology with colonialism. and this is the main thing we've asserted about Marxism on side opposition, side government has now refuted us, that Marxism fundamentally opposes the idea of one class oppressing another. As a result, it is least incompatible with colonialism. That means we can use the power of Marxism, and Marxism in the 60s is very popular around the world, to convince people to throw off their colonial shackles. Second of all, we need to compel our overlord to release us. This is going to happen some way. Side government doesn't present us a clear plan. They say, well, maybe we could do it peacefully. Maybe we could convince the middle-class members of our society to talk to the Europeans, and they'll let us go. This isn't very compelling. They haven't warranted this in any particular way. If we assume any sort of rational actor analysis on the part of European powers, they're going to want to retain their colonies. They benefit economically and in terms of prestige from this. And so, insofar as they haven't presented a reason why Europe is going to want to let us go, then they can't say that they will. However, on the Marxist side, we presented cogent examples of how previously in history, a Marxist revolution is an extremely effective way. China managed to rend itself free of American influence as a result of a Marxist revolution, because a violent revolution is simply the most efficient way of doing this. Once you have taken control of the country, your overlord has no option but to release you. It succeeded in Cuba. It succeeded in North Vietnam. And we can rely on Soviet support because we have seen that they supported to such a great extent Cuba and Vietnam as side government conceded. So when they don't have any idea of what they're doing and they don't have any idea of how their plan is going to produce the solutions they propose, we simply can't side with side government. Thank you.
For that speech, we now call upon the Prime Minister to close out this round. Same caveats. Here we go.
So I think I have a lot to give you in this speech because they fundamentally mischaracterize a lot of our examples and how this is actually going to work out. But this boils down to 3 questions. How do you get a revolution started? How do you win that revolution? What does your country look like after? First thing, how do you start a revolution? First thing you need to do is get a support base. I think both sides agree with this. However, what they've never contended is what we tell you is when you are able on our side of the house to have this is the goal of our revolution, independence, not policy, this is when you're able to get the broadest support base. Now what we think is really important is that nationalists will not support Marxism, but Marxists will absolutely support nationalism because it gets you a step closer to your goal of independence, right? No matter what people's ideologies are, when you focus as independence as your goal, this is so important. Why are people on face going to reject Marxism, though? This is so, so important. The first thing we tell you, though, is one that they don't understand it, and they definitely don't want it based on the picture they've been getting from Europe. Because to them, it is just another European imperialist ideology. They see, like imperialism, colonialism, these things are not coherent with Marxism, and they disregarded all of Matt's examples that every major communist power has colonies, oppresses people, kills their own people, and this is absolutely what then they never contest again. Europe is then showing to their colonies. They're not going to say, look at happy, go la la Russia, right? It's the gulags, the killing fields. That's what they're seeing. And they find, people are able to see through the media because, definitely Europe's letting a wide variety of media into their colonies because that's exactly what happens. But beyond that, what we also then say is Marxism, on face says in the ideology that it's not meant to appeal to everyone because of what we've told you, this same thing, this capitalist false consciousness that has told you, this is what you believe, which means Marxism isn't going to be able to appeal to these people. But furthermore, at this point, why do they not want Marxism at all? It's because what Matt tells you that never gets addressed fully is that Marxism literally says, no, you can't have culture because history is materially determined. Insofar as these people, if you buy their ideology, or if you buy their advocacy, that they want their culture so purely that they've been deprived of, they absolutely do not want Marxism that says, I don't care if you're Hutu, I don't care if you're Tutsi, fuck it, you have no culture at all. This is absolutely damning for their side. Second question, though. How do you win this revolution? Saying you get a support base at all. First thing they tell you, okay, well, here's some examples of nationalist revolutions, communist revolutions that have worked, right? But India didn't work. Well, let me tell you, India wasn't truly a nationalist revolution. Second thing, though, they say China did it. So here's something, Matt tells you, sure, China did it when 100 million people died. They say industrialization, as China shows you, isn't necessary to have a revolution. No, but we think it's necessary to survive that revolution, right? So China, we don't think is the example they ought to hang their hat on because that clearly did not go well. But beyond that, how do you actually win a revolution on the ground? So you actually need money for guns and an ability to negotiate with Europe. Because we don't think that in any way do you have money in your kind of these agrarian systems. For both of these things, money and political will, you need the bourgeoisie. They inherently have to either get rid of them or actually kill them in their country to be a Marxist revolution. You lose any sort of negotiating power, any sort of money you actually have on that point alone, they can't win this revolution. But now beyond that, because then we're going to talk about some allies. We say when the U.S. doesn't back your oppressor, you have a much better chance of winning. When you say, hi, I am communist, to Europe and to the United States, they absolutely back your colonial oppressor. They say, no, don't worry though, the USSR will come in. They don't address, and that tells you the Comintern is empty at this point. They've been dealing with all these other revolutions. But beyond that, when they say, okay, you know, we're not going to take like strict Marxism, like Leninism, etc., we're going to make our own version of Marxism, at that point, because the Sino-Soviet split just happened, the USSR will not support you any money that's like sitting at the bottom of the Comintern, even at that point. But beyond them, something that goes dropped from PMC, right, is you can find local allies on our side of the house because you're able to relate to them. You're able to say, no, nationalism in this sense means that these borders are not necessarily correctly drawn. We're able to redraw them on our side of the house and say people that are living like arbitrarily 20 feet across this border, you know, you should probably actually identify with us and support us. And we'll talk about like how this works in a geopolitical environment at the next point. Which is our final idea. How do you maintain a stable, unified state afterward? So I think otherwise there's no point in having this revolution. There's nothing to take though. Our example of the United States always comes in and ends you is in the case of colonial revolutions, right? So Cuba, not the same thing, already an established state. When a colonial revolution has happened and it has been communist, the U.S. always comes in and deals with it. We're not even saying that like the U.S. necessarily wins, but given that they come in and fuck you over, for the most part they do win and replace you with a puppet government. And in fact, when you are a Marxist revolutionary, they literally kill you. You're not going to be able to advocate for this. But furthermore, why can't Marxism actually happen in the long term? This is so, so important. You don't have any sort of infrastructure. You don't have industrialization. You don't have a working class, meaning Marxism fundamentally cannot happen in your country. Let me tell you, the way that we're able to allocate resources in our side of the house, this again goes unaddressed, now to repair the wounds of the past. Like, if there are disproportionate resource allocation by an oppressive like European state, like you can deal with this and say nationalistically, we think everyone ought to actually be equal. If equality is something your people value, then be equal. You can take like the one maybe good part of Marxism and actually make it work, rather than like not have the infrastructure that supports them. But beyond this, what Matt tells you is like in Marxism, you have to be alienated from the fruits of your labor for like the whole ideology to take place. Because everyone here are pretty much subsistence farmers. They're literally right in there with the fruits of their labor. This is not how this works. Final last two things. We're the only side able to adapt to a changing geopolitical environment. Being that you're popping up in the middle of the Cold War, it is not a good idea to flip off the United States. But even if you buy, like since the Cold War, you don't know how it's going to turn out. If you decide to be Marxist, you're inherently throwing in your hat with one side. If the Cold War doesn't go your way, you're fucked. If you are nationalist, you can choose which side to ally with at a later point, and to say, this is what's going to work best for us. Finally, though, we form a common identity, or even two separate states, which they never address if that's better. Given that the idea of Hutu and Tutsi were invented by the Belgians, these are not like national like, inherent identities, you can find other commonalities, find a safe state. We're proud to propose.
Thanks everyone.